The assassin Karasu Tabito versus the ninja Otoya Ita versus the lone swordsman Yukimiya Kenyu. The Battle of the Uncrowned Kings, as these three are one of the most dominant players in the show, who just happen to get overshadowed by the likes of Isigi, Baro and Ren, but recently with Otoya and Karasu completely dominating in their respective games. It has never been more fitting for us to look at their stats, abilities and explore their best feats, to determine who is the true emperor of the undergrounds. The Crow Father Karasu Tabito, one of the smartest players in Blue Lock, and if you could believe it, much like Isigi, that's the only non-average thing about him. However, and much like Isigi again, because of his big brain he soars very high. But before we talk about what abilities this big brain of his enables him to have, as always we gotta start with his physical stats. Now, as I said before, when it comes to his physicality, Karasu is the definition of average, having average speed and jumping ability, with a slightly above average strength. However, because he's one of the smartest players in the show, he utilizes this strength of his to the fullest. However, in order for us to explain how, we gotta talk about his abilities and weapons. As I said, because Karasu is one of the smartest and one of the most tactical players in the show, he found a way to channel his slightly above average strength into one of the best dueling abilities. And you might be thinking, if he's not a great dribbler and he's not that strong, how could he have an insane dueling ability? However, much like we've seen with Snuffy, Karasu utilizes a secret weapon in order to dominate almost any one-on-one interaction he has and give himself one of the best ball retention in Blue Lock. I'm talking of course about his perfect hand placement. Now before, we actually got to see only Rin and Karasu do this. However, with the introduction of the Neo Egoist League, we learned that the player who utilizes this ability the most is actually none other than Kaiser. You see, despite Kaiser not being that strong, he is so damn hard to engage, specifically due to his hand placement. And in fact, one of the few things that Isigi adapted from Kaiser in addition to meta vision is actually his hand placement, as we can see here. And the fact is, Karasu is the best at this, rivaled only by Rin in his Berserker state. However, I truly believe it shines more with Karasu due to his playing style. You see, this dueling ability gives him such an advantage on the field, because it gives him the time he needs to analyze and read the situation. And this is especially deadly with his assassin playing style, where as described by him, it is a playing style where Karasu targets the weakest link of the team. However, we only saw this in the third selection when he targeted Isigi. In the U20 game and then in the PXG game, we actually saw him target the strongest link in the team, Sai and then Kaiser, and definitely his dueling ability helps him a lot in his assassin playing style. However, I think the weapon that enables him to play like this the most is actually his insane perception, which later enabled him to acquire metavision. But before we talk about metavision yet, first let's talk about what this perception, assassin playing style and dueling ability enable him to be. You see, Karasu without a doubt is the best defensive midfielder we've seen in the show. And not only that, he is the best player we've seen him be the beating heart of a team. As with his tactical play, dueling ability and perception, he is the perfect anchor for both defense and offense. And honestly, he is the best at this not just in the U20 category, but actually among all the players we've seen, if we exclude of course Snuffy. And to be honest, getting beaten by just one pro in this regard is such a huge feat for Karasu. And all of that was before he even unlocked metavision. Now, how Karasu actually acquired it is rather interesting. Before, for the most part of the PXG game, we've seen that Karasu and Rin are the only players without metavision to be able to react to metavision users. First, he was the best anchor for Charles. He allowed Charles' off-the-ball movement weapon to shine insanely with his dueling ability, as he gave him the space he needed. Furthermore, we've seen him constantly on Kaiser limiting his movements and playing a huge role in halting his advancement. And of course, we've seen him play with Rin in order to destroy Kaiser entirely before he rebelled. And actually, even after he rebelled, Karasu still was on him and he still was doing amazing. However, from reacting and playing with these metavision users, Karasu later came to awaken his own. And honestly, ever since he did, he was able to match Hiyori, Isigi, Kaiser no problem. In fact, in addition to Charles, he was the only player on PXG who was able to beat Isigi and Kaiser in their field readability. And this alone means that his metavision is of the highest caliber we've seen. Now, beyond Metavision, I actually want to delve deeper and explore his big brain. As you see, Karasu has an insane feat that wouldn't necessarily translate that well into anything meaningful for our matchup today. However, it is still impressive for me nonetheless, which is his ability to discover the hidden talent of other players. He did it with Hiyori, but more impressively he did it with Isigi, where he deducted that Isigi's best feature is actually his adaptability. And later, after we learned about the talented learner thing, we discovered that Isigi is the best talented learner specifically because of his adaptability. And Karasu being the first other than Ego to discover this is honestly rather impressive. However, and even regardless of this, overall I'd say Karasu is one of the most impressive non-striker players in the entirety of the show, and definitely one of the most underrated characters in Blue Lock, as he is without a doubt one of the most dominant ones. But can he assassinate the ninja and the lone swordsman? The Shadow Warrior, Otoya Ita. Now, if I say Karasu is underrated, he does not hold a candle to Otoya in this regard, as Ita is probably the most underrated character in the entirety of Blue Lock. Like seriously, there isn't really a busted character that the community hates or not care about more than Otoya. And in fact, I don't even blame the community for this, because honestly in the U20 game he had an awful performance, being the worst player on the Blue Lock side from those who played. But, and as always, the PXG game proves why it is the best ever, where now we get to understand where most players can shine depending on their environment and their ego type. Otoya finding freedom at Barcha really allowed him to shine very well. But before I get ahead of myself, first we gotta talk about his physical stats. Now, Otoya is not like Karasu. I mean, he is average when it comes to strength and jumping ability, but he is a speed demon. However, unlike other speedsters like Zantetsu and Kaiser, Otoya is very different, because he utilizes his speed in a very special way, which, in order for us to explore it, it is time for us to jump into his abilities and weapons. And straight up, the first ability I want to talk about is his ninja step, his stealthy and silent off-the-ball footwork, where we've seen him capable of taking even a pro by surprise due to his insane footwork. And honestly, this alone makes him one of the best off-the-ball players in Blue Lock. And when you couple this with his insane speed, it honestly becomes super deadly. And I reckon a team is required to have a player with insane perception like Lorenzo, or Metavision users like Isigi and his opponent today Karasu, in order to anticipate and then stop Otoya. And you might think that Darai was able to stop him in the U20 game. Well, as I said, the level of the Blue Lockers in the Neo Egoist League, especially towards its final chapters, is insanely higher than the level of those exact players in the U20 game. And so I honestly do not think that Darai will be able to stop Neo Egoist League Otoya. And as I said, him taking Chris Prince by surprise is such an insane feat. And I know Prince's strong point isn't really reading the field, but this is still a feat that not many players in Blue Lock can boast about. In fact, only Isigi can boast about a similar feat. And even then, Isigi did it with Noah, and Otoya fucking scored after doing it. Which means, I'm not going to lie, this is one of the most impressive feats ever. And to explain this further, I gotta go back to the ego chart. You see, being a freedom type of an egoist, he found himself at home with FC Barcha, where they gave him complete freedom, which allowed him to become independent of any particular player, which is the complete opposite of him before, where we saw him heavily rely on Karasu. And this is why I said now, Darai could not hope to stop Otoya. And honestly, with this freedom and his independence, he now feels like a complete superstar. And he would have been entirely broken and extremely lethal if it wasn't for his low field readability and perception. You see, as I said, his footwork is of the best caliber, rivaling even Isigi and Kaiser. However, he is missing in the perception point. And as we have seen in the case of Lorenzo and Ren, they both don't have Metavision, yet they dominate Metavision players specifically due to their insane perception. And I can't help but feel that this is kinda hurting Otoya, and it kinda makes it seem as if he is one step away from greatness. He is truly the definition of an uncrowned king. But even with this, Otoya still is one of the deadliest strikers in Blue Lock and the stealthiest killer in the show. But can the ninja stealth kill the assassin and the one-on-one emperor? Yuki Kenyu, the sinking ship and the one-on-one emperor. one of the characters who played a huge role in the Neo-Egoist League, being the main ideology antagonist in the Manshine City game, which, judging by how it went, I can say it was not a good role, but it is an important one nonetheless. However, from that despair and after that setback, Yuki managed to grow insanely, and now he is a very threatening striker, and one whom I think has one of the brightest futures in Blue Lock. But as always, before I get ahead of myself, first let's talk about his physical stats. Now the case with Yuki is kinda the same with Otoya. He does not have great physicality nor jumping ability. However, again he is a speed demon, and much like Otoya, he uses his speed in a special way, which perfectly reflects his signature ability. And this leads us exactly to talking about his abilities and weapons. The first of which is actually the one that utilizes his speed the most, which is his dribbling. Now Yuki has one of the best dribbling abilities in all of Blue Lock, which is saying something considering it is an active dribbling, where Yuki, instead of reacting to his opponents like Rin, Sai and Hiyori, he exerts moves that come from his genius much like Bachira. And before, this dribbling ability gave him the label of the one-on-one emperor. Well, that was until Rin went berserk and Bachira trained under Lavinio. However, as we have seen at the end of the PXG game, he actually happily discarded the one-on-one emperor, as in the Manshine City and Uber's game he learned that football isn't played one-on-one. One must learn to account for other players even if they don't have the same talent as you, which honestly this was his biggest shortcoming, not accounting for other players, as we've seen him most of the time dribbles past the important players and then lose to a random defender showing up at the last moment. It happened with Ario, then it happened with Aiku, and finally happened with Chris Prince. And what enabled him to get rid of this weakness was his ideology rivalry with Isigi. And in fact, Yuki lost that battle so miserably we honestly felt pity for him. And by the way, this goes to show you the difference between him and, for example, Baro, who after failing to score in the U20 game, he immediately started accounting for the players that would stop him, mainly Darai and Aiku, and there Baro realized that he needs a new path towards the goal, something that Yuki was extremely against. And I know I keep bringing up Rin, Isigi and Baro when talking about these players, however I feel because these are the uncrowned kings, it is only fitting for me to actually explain to you guys why they are not competing with the likes of Isigi, Rin and Baro. However, and going back to Yuki, after ridding himself of this weakness, he became a completely different character. And honestly, he feels the same as Isigi when he unlocked Metavision, a player with bright future who is just tapping into his full potential. And I just love this about Blue Lock. The writer showed us why Yuki failed. The writer showed us why Isigi's way worked and Yuki did not. And then because he was forced to, Yuki learned from his mistake and now he is a better player. And honestly, I just love the new Yuki, as he was able to account for Karasu and Isigi when dribbling past Shidous and Zantetsu, something he was not able to do at all before. Now I gotta say, failing to Charles is not really an anti-fit to Yuki, since it's fucking Charles. The guy stopped even the link up between Kaiser and Isigi, and hell, he even stopped the Kaiser impact. And speaking of Charles, he was able to stop a deadly shot from Yukimiya that was powered by his newest weapon, which is the Predator Eyes. Once he got rid of his fixation on his current playing style, Yuki was able to evolve and he was able to unlock the Predator Eyes after reacting to Kaiser and Baro. The Predator Eyes are an ocular ability that help a striker translate his shots into goals. And unlike Metavision, it actually has a lot of evolution paths. First, there is the goal course hunting ability that we've seen from Kaiser and Baro, where the striker aims for a very narrow space from where he can force his ball through. Then there is the goalkeeper hunting ability that we have seen from Rin and again Baro, where the striker focuses on the goalkeeper and only shoots when the latter is confused. And finally, we've seen from Rin that the Predator Eyes could be used to target the best and most optimal play by the enemy team and completely stopping it. As for Yuki, we actually do not know what path of evolution he took, because he seemed to be looking at the goalkeeper, but at the same time he did not cover his shot or anything, and it felt as if he was trying to catch a narrow space. And so, I don't know, I'm kinda torn between these two, but I'm leaning towards the goal course hunting ability. And honestly, once he masters the Predator Eyes completely, I believe Yuki will become one of the most complete strikers in Blue Lock, and definitely one of the deadliest. And his performance in the PXG game is a testament to that. However, can Yuki beat the ninja and the assassin? for how this matchup would go, it's honestly hard to say. You see, potential-wise, I think Yuki has the greatest. However, as you all know, I don't really account for potential in my videos, specifically because we don't know if Yuki will ever realize that potential. And I know I included it for Sai, however we know Sai achieved that potential, we just don't know what it is. Unlike Yuki, whom we don't know if he would reach that. Now, if we take potential outside of the equation, Otoya still has the most dominant feat among these three. However, when accounting for all feats, Karasu definitely has the most and actually the most impressive as well. And this honestly leaves Yuki lacking between the three. You see, he doesn't have any broken feat like Otoya, and the sum of his most impressive feats don't stack up to Karasu's. And I know he won against him once, but the name of the game for these matchups is actually consistency. And so, I honestly believe that Yuki will be the official loser of this matchup. I wouldn't say he is far off from the two, but it's definitely between Otoya and Karasu, as I don't see Yuki beating either. As for the ninja and the assassin, well, Otoya has one of the most impressive feats ever. Like, doing that against a pro is honestly such a broken feat, especially because he scored it. And as I said, only Baro and Isigi are capable of boasting of such feats. And even still, Otoya now has 2 goals in the Neo Egoist League, something that might not seem as a big deal to you guys, but actually it is very impressive. As if we exclude Baro and Rin, who both scored 7 goals, the next in line are Isigi, Shido, Bachiro and Kaiser, all scoring 4 goals. Then comes Chigiri and then Otoya with 2 goals. And one of those 2 goals being that impressive, it's honestly looking like Otoya is the best of the 3. However, and again, the collective of his feats don't stack up to Karasu's. You see, Karasu wasn't just the beating heart of PXG, he actually was the anchor and what allowed Charles to shine the way he did. And without him and Charles, PXG would not have been this successful despite it having both Shido and Ren. And it's not just that, man. Him having Metavision, him playing at the highest of caliber consistently with Isigi, Kaiser, Rin and Charles, and also him dominating every player one-on-one, which by the way this includes even Otoya, really makes the scales tip in favor of Karasu. And so, I'd say Karasu is the winner today and the player with the dub. He is the number 1 player of the 3, then comes Otoya and finally Yuki. Now I would say the difference between Yuki and Otoya is bigger than the difference between Otoya and Karasu, as I feel like despite his potential, Yuki right now is pretty lacking against these two. However, that's all I've got for you today guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video and until next time, thank you for watching.